A police officer was driving home on a rainy afternoon when a German shepherd suddenly leapt into the road, soaked, trembling, but refusing to move. She barked once, then turned and stared at him with eyes that felt almost human. Something in that gaze made him stop. He followed her into the woods, and there, beneath the dripping pines, he found not a stray pup, but a little girl, cold, injured, and too weak to call for help. That dog hadn't come for food. She hadn't come for safety. She had come for help, and she chose the one man who had stopped believing in second chances. What happened next would unite an entire town and restore faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. The rain fell like a curtain over redwood pines, a steady gray veil that blurred the outlines of the hills and turned the streets into narrow rivers of reflection. This was Oregon rain, relentless but quiet, the kind that soaked through coats, clung to hair, and pressed the world into a hush. Redwood Pines itself was a small town, tucked between cedar-covered ridges, a scattering of wooden houses with sagging porches and moss-darkened roofs. The sidewalks gleamed, the neon signs at the diner flickered through the mist, and the lamplight on Main Street shivered against the wet pavement. On the edge of town, Old Mill Road curved along the tree line, its shoulders crowded with ferns and blackberry vines heavy with rain. The smell was sharp: wet pine, diesel from passing trucks, and the earthy tang of soil long accustomed to storm. Evening was closing in, the sky a low ceiling of pewter clouds, and the town was already retreating into its lamps and hearths. Few people remained outside, only the occasional silhouette hurrying under an umbrella. Officer Ethan Cole, 38, guided his patrol car carefully through the rain. Tall and lean, he carried the air of someone always braced for one more duty. His face was sharply lined, jaw squared beneath a day's worth of stubble, and his storm-gray eyes had grown practiced at hiding more than they revealed. His brown hair, clipped close, carried threads of early silver above the ears, a quiet sign of years spent under stress. His uniform was neat even at the end of a long shift: creased navy fabric, boots polished more out of habit than pride. To the townspeople, he was known as dependable, even if distant. He was the officer who never forgot a detail, never cracked a joke, and rarely offered a smile. What they did not speak about, though they guessed, was the heaviness he carried. 9 months earlier, Ethan had signed divorce papers, the final end to a marriage frayed by silence. Long before that, a rescue gone wrong at a crash site had left him with a scar inside he rarely admitted to. He had saved lives that day, but not every life, and the weight of failure had grown roots in him. Since then, he moved through his days with a steady, stone-like calm. Some of his fellow officers called him Grumpy Cole, though with a mix of pity and affection. He never protested. He simply did the work, then went home to his small duplex at the edge of town, a place with no dog, no children, just a coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed, and a stack of unopened letters gathering dust on the kitchen table. This evening, the patrol had been uneventful. A broken taillight, a deer wandering too close to a backyard. Nothing more. Ethan looked forward to silence, to stew reheated in the microwave, maybe fixing the squeaky hinge in his kitchen. The rhythm of rain on the roof of his car felt almost like a lullaby. He was ready to leave the town behind for the night. Then the world split open in front of his headlights. From the shadows of the pines, a dog leapt into the road. Ethan's foot slammed the brake, and the patrol car shuddered to a stop, tires hissing on wet asphalt. In the cone of light stood a German shepherd, drenched to the bone. Her sable and silver coat clung tightly to her ribs, rain dripping in rivulets down her fur. She looked to be about 8 or 9 years old, past her prime but strong, her body marked by years of survival. Her left ear bent at the tip, never quite standing, giving her face a lopsided sadness. A faded pink collar hung loosely around her neck, the tag so worn it was unreadable. She limped slightly on one foreleg, though she held herself with the stubborn poise of a creature that refused pity. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. The dog did not bolt as most strays would. She did not cower or pace in panic. Instead, she planted herself firmly in the center of the lane, her amber eyes locked on his. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, man and animal, the rain beating around them. In those eyes was something more than fear. It was a plea, a message unspoken but urgent. The shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding, then turned her head toward the woods. She took 2 steps toward the ditch, paused, and looked back at him again. Her tail was stiff, her stance unwavering. Another bark, louder this time, and then silence, save for the relentless hiss of rain. Ethan sat still, his chest tight. He could have driven on, chalked it up to a stray, told himself it was nothing. Yet something in those amber eyes broke through the armor he had built. It was not desperation for food or fear of danger. It was intent. Clear, insistent, almost human. He sighed, the sound heavy inside the cruiser, then switched on the hazard lights. Rain hammered against the windshield as he pushed the door open. The cold hit him instantly, seeping through his collar, trickling down the back of his neck. The road was slick beneath his boots, the night smelling of wet cedar and iron. The dog waited at the ditch, pacing a short line, glancing back to make sure he was watching. Her body trembled with fatigue, but her eyes never wavered. "You want me to follow?" Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice low and even. Another bark answered him, a sound that carried not wild panic but purpose. Ethan adjusted the beam of his flashlight, its cone of light slicing through the mist and rain. He hesitated only a moment longer, then stepped toward the ditch. Water splashed around his boots as he crossed, the dog moving ahead a few paces, then stopping, looking back, urging him on. The rain thickened, pattering through the branches overhead. The trees loomed tall and dark, their trunks slick, their shadows stretching into the depths of the woods. The dog slipped easily into the underbrush, tail low, body tense, each step careful but determined. Ethan followed, his flashlight beam flickering across wet ferns and roots. Branches reached like fingers, scraping his shoulders, and the ground sucked at his boots with mud. The shepherd glanced over her shoulder once more, her eyes gleaming in the light, then pressed forward into the forest, leaving Ethan with little choice but to keep pace. Something in him stirred, a sense that this was no ordinary stray, no ordinary night. Whatever lay ahead was calling him as surely as it had called her. And so, with rain dripping from the brim of his cap and silence folding around the woods, Ethan Cole stepped off the road and into the shadows, following the dog deeper into the storm. The woods closed around Ethan as he followed the German shepherd deeper into the dripping silence. The rain no longer fell as a curtain, but whispered through the canopy, turning every branch into a conductor for beads of water that slipped and pattered in irregular rhythms. His flashlight beam sliced through the trunks, catching glints of moss, spiderwebs trembling with raindrops, and the occasional pale shimmer of fungus clinging to bark. The dog moved ahead with a limp that did not slow her determination. She paused often, ears cocked, eyes darting back to make sure he was close, then pressed on, threading a path through underbrush that seemed to open for her and close behind him. Ethan's boots sank into mud that clung and pulled, and ferns whipped back into his legs as he passed. Every step felt like leaving the familiar world farther behind. The air thickened with the scent of stone and cold water as the terrain began to slope downward. Ethan's light found the slick sheen of granite, and soon the muffled rush of water reached his ears. The dog quickened her pace despite the limp, tail low but wagging once as if sensing the nearness of her destination. Ethan ducked under a low-hanging branch and emerged into a shallow hollow where the rainwater pooled, fed by a narrow stream that tumbled over rocks. The sound filled the space like a heartbeat. There, wedged between two jutting slabs of stone at the edge of the stream, was a small figure. Ethan froze, breath catching. At first glance it could have been a bundle of rags, but then the bundle shifted, shivering violently. He raised his light and saw the pale face of a child. She was a girl, no older than 8. Her hair was a tangle of chestnut brown, plastered to her cheeks by rain. Mud streaked her fair skin, and a faint bruise shadowed one temple. Her eyes, wide and green like storm-washed glass, blinked against the beam of his flashlight. She wore a thin pink jacket soaked through, clinging to her small frame. Her jeans were ripped at the knees, caked in mud, and her sneakers were sodden, one lace torn. The girl's right leg was twisted awkwardly, her foot jammed between the rocks, the skin scraped and bleeding where sharp stone had bitten into her. Her lips trembled, and each breath she drew seemed shallow with exhaustion. The shepherd hurried forward, whining softly. She pressed her wet muzzle against the girl's hand, licking gently as though to reassure her that the ordeal was nearly over. The child stirred, lifting her hand with trembling fingers to clutch at the dog's ear, her expression softening in recognition. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her, his uniform soaking in the mud without thought. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You're all right now. I've got you." The girl blinked up at him, lips parting. Her voice was hoarse, a whisper dragged out of her throat. "Bella? She didn't leave me." Ethan glanced at the dog. So she had a name. Bella pressed closer, her amber eyes fixed on Ethan, as if demanding proof that he would finish what she had started. The officer reached for the girl's trapped foot. His flashlight beam showed the gash across her ankle, raw but not broken. He set the light aside, bracing one hand on the rock and the other gently on her shoe. "I'm going to get you out of this," he murmured. "It'll hurt for a second, but then it's over." The girl squeezed Bella's fur tighter and nodded weakly. Ethan shifted the stone with his shoulder, feeling the scrape of granite against his jacket. The rock gave slightly, just enough for him to tug her foot free. She cried out, a short gasp of pain, but then her leg was free, and he cradled it carefully across his lap. The bleeding was shallow but messy, the cold making her skin clammy. He pulled a clean cloth from his belt pouch, part of his field kit, and wrapped it firmly around her ankle to stem the blood. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew what the town had been murmuring about. "Sophie," she whispered. "Sophie Miller." Ethan nodded slowly. He remembered the posters taped to shop windows, the anxious voices of neighbors, the hushed talk at the station. Sophie Miller, missing for 2 days. Her parents had searched until exhaustion had broken them, and volunteers had combed the woods without success. Yet here she was, alive, trembling in his arms, saved not by the searches or patrols, but by her dog. "Your mom and dad are waiting for you," Ethan said. "They're not giving up." "Neither are we." Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears, and she turned her face into Bella's neck, whispering something only the dog seemed to understand. Ethan studied her condition quickly. She was chilled to the bone, weak from hunger and fear, but conscious. That was enough to get her home alive. He shrugged off his patrol jacket thick and heavy with rain, and wrapped it around her small frame. She sank into the warmth with a faint sigh. Bella stayed pressed against them both, her body tense but protective, as if guarding Ethan as much as the girl. Up close, Ethan noticed the faint gray along her muzzle, the hardened pads of her paws, the way her ribs showed through her wet coat. She had spent 2 nights in these woods, enduring the storm to keep the child alive. There was a nobility in her fatigue, a grace that humbled him. Carefully, Ethan lifted Sophie into his arms. She was light, far too light, her small body curling instinctively into his chest. Her hair smelled of mud and rain, her heartbeat a faint flutter against him. Bella trotted close, keeping pace despite her limp, her gaze fixed forward as if guiding them both. Ethan angled his flashlight back toward the path. Every sound in the woods seemed sharper now, the trickle of the creek, the groan of branches under wind, the hiss of rain. Yet, beneath it all, he heard the steadiness of Sophie's breathing, and the quiet faith of a dog who had refused to abandon her child. Step by step, he began the climb out of the hollow, his boots sinking deep, the girl warm against him, the shepherd always a shadow at his side. The forest pressed close around Ethan as he carried Sophie, his arms tightening against the tremors that still shook her thin frame. His patrol jacket, wrapped around her shoulders, was far too large but held the heat of his body, and she clung to it with desperate fingers. Her head rested against his chest, her eyes fluttering open every few steps only to close again. She was still conscious, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Ethan shifted her carefully, adjusting his grip so her injured ankle remained supported. He moved steadily, each step a battle with mud that sucked at his boots and roots that snatched at his footing. The rain had softened, falling now as a mist that clung to his hair and skin, but the cold in the woods was merciless. He could feel Sophie's small body trembling through the layers of fabric. At his side, Bella trotted with her uneven gait, limping but tireless. Her amber eyes flicked constantly between Ethan and the path ahead, ears shifting at every sound. The pink collar around her neck sagged against her soaked fur, and the silvering along her muzzle gleamed whenever Ethan's flashlight beam passed over her face. She had been Sophie's guardian in the storm, standing between a child and the merciless dark, and now she remained at her post, never more than a step away from Ethan's boots. Ethan looked down at her once, quietly marveling. "You didn't leave her," he murmured, half to himself. "Not for a minute." Bella gave no acknowledgement beyond keeping pace, but there was a steadiness in her presence that spoke louder than words. The climb out of the hollow felt endless. Twice Ethan had to stop and adjust Sophie's weight, shifting her higher against his chest. She stirred each time, whispering incoherently, and Bella pressed close to nuzzle her hand until she settled again. When at last they broke through the final curtain of brush, the faint silver glow of the road appeared ahead, shining through the trees like a promise. Ethan emerged onto the shoulder of Old Mill Road with a grunt of relief, boots squelching onto gravel. His patrol car still sat with hazard lights pulsing dimly against the rain, the only vehicle on the deserted stretch. He opened the back door and eased Sophie onto the seat, layering the spare blanket from the trunk over her. She whimpered faintly, curling into the warmth, her green eyes flickering open to search for Bella. The shepherd leapt gracefully into the car before Ethan could even gesture, circling once before settling against Sophie's side. She draped her body protectively over the child's legs, her head resting near Sophie's shoulder, eyes half closed but still watchful. Sophie reached for her fur, fingers tightening, and whispered hoarsely, "Bella?" The name floated in the air like a secret given form. Ethan stood for a moment in the rain, watching the pair together, a silent swell rising in his chest. It was as if the girl had survived not by chance, not by his arrival, but by the unbroken loyalty of this one dog. He shut the door softly, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The patrol car hummed, headlights cutting once more through the mist. He pulled onto the road, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt, and aimed toward the town. As the miles slipped past, Sophie drifted into shallow sleep, her breath evening out, her cheek pressed into Bella's fur. Ethan kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror. The sight carved a quiet place inside him, one he had not allowed in years. He remembered the silence of his own empty home, the dust on the letters, the plant on the windowsill surviving on neglect. It struck him then how loudly a small child's breathing could fill a void when paired with a dog's unyielding devotion. The forest gave way to the faint outlines of the town as Ethan drove. Porch lights glimmered through the mist, and the water tower loomed as a familiar shadow. When he turned onto Main Street, the diner's neon cup buzzed faintly, casting a reflection on the wet pavement. The town slept, unaware that one of its children was coming home. He pulled into the lot of the medical clinic, a low building with a faded sign and a single lamp burning over the door. This was where injured townsfolk went when hospitals were too far. He knew Hannah Brooks, the doctor, would be there. She often worked late shifts, her reputation for stubborn devotion nearly as strong as her skill. For now, though, Ethan did not wake her. He stepped out of the car, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, and opened the rear door to check Sophie again. She stirred faintly, still clutching Bella. "Stay with her," Ethan whispered to the dog. Bella lifted her head and blinked at him slowly, as though the instruction was redundant. He stood there in the rain for a long breath, the weight of exhaustion settling into his shoulders. Yet beneath the fatigue, something else stirred, a recognition that this moment, this pairing of child and dog, was more than survival. It was a quiet heroism, born not from strength of arms, but from loyalty unshaken by fear or cold. Ethan knew then that Bella was more than just a pet. She was the silent hero of this night, the reason Sophie still breathed. And as the rain softened into a mist that barely touched the pavement, Ethan Cole squared his shoulders, ready to step inside the clinic and deliver both child and dog to safety. The small medical clinic at the center of Redwood Pines sat at the corner of Main and Willow, a squat brick building with a shingled roof that glistened under the mist. Its windows were lit in soft amber, the only glow breaking the hush of the sleeping town. Ethan pulled into the narrow lot and killed the engine, headlights dimming to darkness. He stepped into the rain, opened the back door of the cruiser, and gently lifted Sophie into his arms. She stirred faintly, mumbling a sound that dissolved into Bella's fur as the dog pressed close, leaping out beside them. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and old pine floors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind the front desk, a figure looked up from a clipboard. Dr. Hannah Brooks was 34, tall and slender with a long frame that moved with quiet assurance. Her hair, the color of rich mahogany, was pulled back into a loose bun with strands escaping to soften her angular cheekbones. She wore little makeup, and her skin was pale with freckles crossing the bridge of her nose, evidence of summers once spent outdoors. Her eyes were green-gray, sharp yet kind, the sort that measured you carefully, but never unkindly. She had grown into her profession through trial. Her father, once the town's only physician, had passed suddenly, leaving her to step into his role. Grief had carved her maturity early, and though she rarely spoke of him, her manner carried a seriousness that seemed older than her years. Hannah pushed back from the desk, setting the clipboard aside. "Ethan?" Her voice held surprise, but also the crisp tone of someone already cataloging injuries. "Bring her in." Exam room 2. Ethan followed quickly, his boots echoing across the linoleum. Bella padded at his side, leaving a wet trail of paw prints. The girl in his arms shivered, her lips pale. Hannah swung the door wide and gestured him to the padded table. "Set her here," she instructed, already snapping on gloves. As Ethan laid Sophie gently onto the table, Hannah bent close. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her voice softened, steady and low. Sophie's eyelids flickered, and she nodded faintly. Hannah began her work with a practiced rhythm, checking vitals, peeling back the soaked jacket, inspecting the makeshift bandage Ethan had wrapped. She frowned but said nothing, her hands sure and gentle. Bella stood with her front paws braced on the table, whining softly. Hannah glanced at the dog, a quick smile tugging the corner of her mouth. "She's protective." "Good. Don't worry, girl, we'll help her." Sophie opened her eyes more fully now. Her voice was thin, barely more than a breath. "Her name's Bella. She never left me." Ethan watched as Hannah nodded. "Bella," she repeated gently, stroking the dog's damp ear before returning to her work. "All right, Sophie, I'm just cleaning this up." She poured antiseptic, the sharp smell filling the room. Sophie winced, but didn't cry. Out! When the worst was bandaged and Sophie lay under a warm blanket, Ethan stepped back, rolling his shoulders to ease the ache of carrying her. Hannah gave him a brief look, one that seemed to read exhaustion in his face. "She's dehydrated and chilled. But she's lucky. A few more hours and we'd be having a different conversation." Ethan nodded grimly. "She's been missing 2 days. At that, Sophie stirred again, her voice hoarse. It wasn't just getting lost. Both adults turned to her. Ethan crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "What do you mean, Sophie?" She swallowed, staring at the ceiling. "A man. I didn't know him. He told me he would show me a shortcut. He took my hand." Her small body tensed, and Bella pressed closer, resting her head on Sophie's stomach as if to anchor her. Ethan's jaw tightened. "What happened then?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "He pulled me off the path." But Bella barked and bit his sleeve. He yelled, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I don't know where I was going, but Bella kept running with me. Then, I got stuck. I couldn't move my foot. I thought he'd find me." Ethan reached to steady her shoulder. "But he didn't." "You did everything right." His voice was steady, though inside a storm gathered. Hannah looked sharply at him. "This wasn't an accident, then?" "Not just a lost child." Ethan stood, his face hardening into the lines the town rarely saw. "No. This is attempted abduction." The words dropped heavy into the room. Hannah's hand lingered on Sophie's arm, grounding her, but her eyes were troubled. She had lived long enough in Redwood Pines to know their small town carried shadows no one wanted to admit. Sophie clutched Bella tighter. "He's still out there," she whispered. Ethan crouched again, his tone firm but calm. "You're safe now." "He's not here. Bella made sure of that, and so will we." He looked into the shepherd's amber eyes, acknowledging her role as more than instinct. This was choice. Loyalty turned into action. For a long moment, the room was filled only with Sophie's quiet breaths, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the steady beat of rain on the roof. Finally, Hannah straightened, pulling off her gloves. "She needs rest. I'll keep her overnight for observation." "But Ethan—" She hesitated, then dropped her voice. "If there's a man targeting children in these woods, we can't treat this like a local accident." "This is serious." Ethan nodded once, jaw set. "I'll make the call." But for now, no one outside this room knows more than they need to. We keep her safe first." Hannah studied him a moment, then gave a short nod. Her eyes softened as she smoothed Sophie's hair back from her forehead. "You're brave, Sophie. Sleep now. We'll watch over you." The girl's eyelids drifted shut. Bella's body curled protectively at her side. Ethan stood in silence, the weight of what Sophie had said pressing into him like the rain pressing into the earth. He knew then this was no ordinary rescue. It was the beginning of something darker, something that would not end with one child safe beneath a blanket. By morning, the rain had finally broken. A pale sun hovered uncertainly above redwood pines, its light weak but welcome, spilling across rooftops still dripping from the storm. The news of Sophie Miller's rescue moved quickly, whispered first among neighbors over coffee, and then spoken aloud across porches, in the aisles of the grocery, and beneath the awning of the post office. By midday, the town was already alive with speculation. Some said she had simply gotten lost. Others claimed she had been hiding, frightened of punishment, and a few dismissed it as an overreaction to a child's wanderings. Ethan Cole knew otherwise, and so did Dr. Hannah Brooks. That afternoon, they called a community meeting at the town hall, a squat wooden building with peeling white paint and a flag that still clung damply to its pole. Inside, the hall filled with townspeople, some in work boots and flannel shirts still dusted from the lumberyard, others in pressed slacks from the insurance office, and mothers with children fidgeting on their laps. The murmur of conversation hummed beneath the creak of the rafters. Ethan stood near the front, his tall frame rigid, his uniform replaced by a plain gray shirt and dark jeans. Without the badge visible, he looked more like the man he was off duty. Strong-shouldered, tired-eyed, carrying weight silently. Beside him stood Hannah Brooks, her long frame straight and composed. She wore a dark green cardigan over her work clothes, her mahogany hair tied back neatly. Her green-gray eyes scanned the room with quiet intensity, the kind of gaze that commanded attention without demanding it. She was not a politician, but her calm confidence made her words carry weight. At the back of the hall, Harold Jensen, the grocery store owner, shifted in his chair. He was in his early 50s, heavyset with a broad chest and thinning blonde hair that had turned gray at the temples. His ruddy face carried permanent lines of discontent, the kind of man who had grown accustomed to voicing skepticism before offering help. Harold had built a reputation in Redwood Pines as a man who didn't believe in fussing. He sold his goods fairly, but always with a grumble. Life had disappointed him more than once, and he no longer pretended otherwise. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice steady, though not polished. "You've all heard by now. Sophie Miller was found last night. She's alive because of a dog that refused to leave her side. But she wasn't just lost. She was taken off the path by a man she didn't know." The murmurs in the hall grew louder, uneasy. Ethan raised a hand. "She managed to escape. That's the only reason she's here today. This isn't rumor. This isn't just a child wandering off. We have someone out there who tried to take her." Hannah stepped forward, her voice softer but sharper in its conviction. "I treated Sophie myself. She told me about the stranger. And I can tell you this much, her fear is real. She's not inventing stories. We need to act, not as scattered neighbors, but as a town that protects its own." From his seat, Harold let out a low chuckle. "With respect, Doctor, kids make up things when they're scared." Maybe she panicked. "We've all had raccoons or drifters in the woods. Doesn't mean we've got some child snatcher lurking around." A few heads nodded, but many more turned toward him with frowns. Hannah's lips tightened, but before she could reply, the heavy side door creaked open, Every head turned. Sophie Miller stepped hesitantly inside, supported by her mother's gentle hand. The girl looked small beneath the weight of the borrowed sweater she wore, her brown hair brushed but still uneven from her time in the forest. Her green eyes darted nervously around the crowded room, but at her side trotted Bella, her sable and silver coat still rough from the storm. The German shepherd kept close, her body pressed protectively against Sophie's leg, her amber eyes sweeping the hall with quiet vigilance. The room hushed. Children stopped squirming. Adults leaned forward. Sophie's mother guided her to the front, but it was Sophie who clutched Bella's collar and whispered, "I can do it." She stood shakily before the town. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "He tried to take me." I didn't know him. He held my hand and said he'd show me a shortcut. But it was a lie. Bella saved me. She barked and bit his sleeve, and I ran. I thought I was going to die. I thought I'd never see my mom again. Tears streaked her cheeks, and she bent to wrap her arms around Bella's neck. She never left me. Not 1 minute. She kept me safe. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of a truth that no one could ignore. Harold Jensen shifted in his seat, his face reddening, but he said nothing more. Then, slowly at first, the room filled with applause. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her cheeks. A man from the mill nodded solemnly, and soon the hall swelled with clapping that grew into something like a pledge. Ethan felt the shift in the air, the moment when a community stopped doubting and began believing. When the noise settled, Ethan stepped forward once more. "We can't undo what happened to Sophie. But we can make sure it doesn't happen again. We'll set patrols, coordinate searches, and protect our children. But we'll need everyone. This isn't just law enforcement. This is all of us." For the first time in a long while, Redwood Pines stood united, their doubts stripped away by the small voice of a frightened girl and the steadfast presence of her silent guardian. The air in Redwood Pines cooled quickly after sunset. The forest, so ordinary in daylight, transformed into a living shadow of itself. Trunks rising like black columns, branches locking together overhead to form a ceiling that trapped every sound. A thin moon glowed behind ragged clouds, and the scent of wet soil lingered, sharp and metallic. Ethan Cole stood with his back pressed against a cedar, his breathing controlled, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. His patrol jacket was gone. Tonight he wore a plain navy shirt beneath his vest, blending into the gloom. Beside him, his flashlight was clipped to his belt, its beam covered until needed. The forest demanded silence. The decision to set up an ambush had been made quickly. Sophie's description of the stranger, combined with tracks Ethan had found near the creek, suggested deliberate movement rather than random wandering. So Ethan had gathered a small patrol team of 3 other officers. They were locals, men who had grown up in Redwood Pines and carried its soil under their nails. Closest to him was Deputy Mark Reyes, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with thick black hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were dark, watchful, and carried the weariness of someone who had seen too many small-town disputes turn ugly. Mark had once been a high school football star before an injury ended any dreams beyond the county line. Still, his loyalty to the town never wavered, and he carried himself with quiet gravity. Tonight, his hands rested firmly on the stock of his shotgun, his jaw tight. Further down the ridge crouched Officer Dan Whitmore, the youngest of the team at 26. Tall and lanky, his sandy blonde hair stuck out beneath his cap, and his pale skin flushed easily in the cold. Dan was eager, almost too eager, with a reputation for rushing before thinking. He idolized Ethan, often mimicking his calm demeanor but rarely succeeding. Still, his heart was unshakable, and Ethan had chosen him deliberately, to temper his rashness with discipline under pressure. The last man was Deputy Carl Hendricks, nearing 50, his grizzled beard flecked with gray. Shorter than the others, stocky in build, his eyes were small but sharp, the kind that never missed movement in the underbrush. Carl had lived his entire life hunting and fishing in the hills around Redwood Pines, and he treated the woods like an old friend that demanded respect. He spoke little, trusted fewer, but his instincts were rarely wrong. Tonight, his calm presence anchored the group. Ethan signaled silently with 2 fingers, and the men shifted into their positions, forming a loose perimeter along the ridge above a narrow animal path. According to Sophie, this was where the man had first lured her, and the tracks confirmed recent use. Bella, though not officially part of the patrol, lay low at Ethan's side. The German shepherd's fur glistened faintly in the moonlight, and her ears twitched at every sound. Though she limped slightly from her days in the rain, her body remained taut with readiness, amber eyes never leaving the shadows below. Time stretched. The forest was a patient teacher, and silence pressed down on them like weight. An owl called once, then again, then fell quiet. Then, faintly, came the sound of crunching leaves. Ethan stiffened. From the darkness emerged 2 figures, both pushing a handcart with rattling wheels. The cart was loaded with wire cages, inside of which glimmered pairs of terrified eyes, a fox, a raccoon, even what looked like a young bobcat. The animals shifted and whimpered as the cart bumped over roots. The first man was tall and lean, wearing a camouflage jacket and a cap pulled low. His beard was scraggly, unkempt, and his eyes darted nervously. The second man was shorter, heavier, his shoulders thick under his jacket. His face was square, jaw covered in rough stubble, and his hands gripped the cart like it was the only thing tethering him to purpose. Both men moved with the sureness of routine. Ethan's gut tightened. These were not simple hunters. They were poachers, trapping animals not for food but for trade. He raised a hand to signal his team. But then, a mistake, a small sound behind them. Dan, shifting his weight, snapped a twig beneath his boot. The taller poacher froze. "You hear that?" he muttered. The shorter man snarled, pulling a flashlight from his pocket and swinging it wildly. The beam cut across the ridge, and Ethan ducked low, heart pounding. But the light caught something unexpected. Movement at the edge of the trees where Bella had strayed forward, her amber eyes glowing back in the beam. "Dog," the shorter man growled. He started forward, leaving the cart. But just then, another sound pierced the night. Sophie's faint voice. She had come with Hannah, against Ethan's wishes, waiting at the road nearby. Now, worried for Bella, Sophie had stepped too close. "Bella," she called, her small figure visible in the moonlight clearing. The taller poacher's eyes lit up with something more than recognition. Opportunity. He lunged forward, abandoning the cart, and moved toward Sophie. Ethan's blood surged cold. He broke from cover, sprinting downhill. "Stay back," he shouted. The poacher ignored him, reaching for Sophie. But in the instant his hand stretched forward, Bella launched herself from the shadows. The German shepherd slammed into the man's side, teeth snapping onto his sleeve, dragging him off balance. The man cursed, stumbling as Ethan closed the distance. With one swift motion, Ethan tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. The second poacher tried to flee, but Mark Reyes was faster, stepping from cover with shotgun raised. Not another step. The man froze, his chest heaving. Carl Hendricks moved in to bind his hands with a practiced grip, while Dan, face pale but determined, secured the cages. Sophie clung to Hannah, who had rushed from the road, her arms wrapped tightly around the child. Bella limped back to Sophie's side, tail wagging weakly, fur bristled but eyes calm now. Sophie bent to hug her fiercely, whispering, "You saved me again." Ethan hauled the captured man upright, his jaw tight. "It's over," he said, his voice like stone. And for the first time that night, the forest seemed to exhale, its silence returning, not of fear, but of justice briefly restored. The night had been long and heavy, but morning arrived with a quiet majesty that redwood pines had not seen in days. The rain was gone, leaving behind a sky washed pale and streaked with faint gold. The town, nestled between its evergreen ridges, breathed as if it too had endured the storm and come through changed. Porch flags fluttered gently, the mill pond shimmered with sunlight, and the streets carried the hum of neighbors walking together with renewed purpose. At the sheriff's office, the two men arrested the night before sat behind bars. Their faces were drawn, their clothes still damp from the chase. The younger of the two officers, Dan Whitmore, had been the first to walk past the holding cell that morning, and though his shoulders slumped with fatigue, there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he carried himself not just as an eager deputy, but as a man who had faced fear and stood his ground. Mark Reyes and Carl Hendricks moved with steady composure, handling the paperwork that would hand the poachers over to state authorities. Ethan Cole stood over the desk, his broad shoulders bent as he signed his final report, his storm-gray eyes calm but resolute. Justice had not ended in the forest. It was beginning here. News of the arrest spread swiftly. By mid-morning, families gathered in the town square. The diner poured free coffee, and Harold Jensen, the skeptical grocer who so often resisted involvement, showed up carrying 2 sacks of fresh bread, muttering that people needed to eat. His ruddy face looked softer than usual, his eyes lowered in something close to apology. It was not grand, but it was enough. His way of joining the unity that now wrapped around redwood pines. Sophie Miller arrived at the square with her parents, both of whom wore the exhaustion of worry and the relief of reunion. Her mother, a petite woman with wavy blonde hair pulled into a loose braid and lines of sleepless nights etched across her pale face, never let go of Sophie's hand. Her father, tall and lanky with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, stood beside them, his expression somber yet full of gratitude. The family moved slowly through the crowd, neighbors parting to let them pass. At Sophie's side walked Bella, her sable and silver coat brushed, but still showing the scars of the storm. She limped faintly, yet her posture remained noble, her amber eyes alert and watchful. Around her neck hung a garland of wild daisies, placed there by a local child, and she carried it with quiet dignity. When Sophie and Bella stepped into the center of the square, the chatter fell away. Sophie's green eyes, though weary, shone with courage. She bent to wrap her arms around Bella's strong neck, her small voice carrying across the silence. She never left me. She saved me. She's my hero. The townsfolk broke into applause. It began softly, then grew until it filled every corner of the square. Some cheered, others wiped tears, and many simply nodded in solemn agreement. For once, skepticism had no voice. Only unity remained. Hannah Brooks stood near Ethan, her slender frame relaxed, her mahogany hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. The morning light softened the seriousness in her green-gray eyes, and a faint smile touched her lips as she watched Sophie and Bella. She turned slightly toward Ethan. "It's not every day you see a town change overnight." Ethan's gaze lingered on the girl and her dog, then drifted across the crowd, neighbors who had once turned inward, now reaching outward to one another. He exhaled slowly. "Sometimes it only takes one voice," he said, and one dog that refused to let go. For Ethan, the moment cut deeper. He had spent years walled off, silent in his grief and solitude. Yet here, watching Sophie cling to Bella and seeing Hannah's quiet steadiness at his side, something long dormant stirred awake. He realized the armor he had carried, the stone mask his fellow officers joked about, was no longer unbreakable. As the morning sunlight grew brighter, Sophie nestled her face against Bella's fur, whispering words that only those closest could hear. "You saved me. You're my angel." Bella leaned into her, tail sweeping the ground slowly, amber eyes closing with the simple trust of an animal who asked for nothing in return. Ethan looked at Hannah, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, his mouth softened into the beginnings of a smile. The storm had passed, not just in the skies above Redwood Pines, but within him. The town stood together, the shadows of fear lifted, as dawn painted the horizon with light that promised renewal. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning, but with the soft bark of a faithful dog, the trembling hand of a child, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to act. In Sophie's rescue, we see not just the loyalty of Bella or the determination of Officer Ethan, but the grace of God shining through the simplest of moments, reminding us that He never abandons us, even in the darkest woods. Just as Bella never left Sophie's side, God never leaves ours. He places protectors, friends, and even unexpected angels in our path to remind us that love is stronger than fear, and that every day holds the possibility of redemption and hope. And now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts about Bella's miracle in the comments. If you believe that God still works through small everyday wonders, tap the like button. Share this story with someone who needs hope. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, faith, and love. May the Lord bless you, keep you safe, and remind you that even in life's storms, His grace is always near.